If you're curious about atomic bombs and want to know how they were created, I have my book here for you, The Atom is a Weapon, which is available on Amazon and also at the WeClap store via the description link or on-screen QR code. If you want your copy autographed by me for you, just send an email to Sala de Guerra with your Zone Improvement Plan code so I can calculate the shipping. Last night, then, Israel claimed to have eliminated Ali Lariani. He was reportedly the victim of a missile attack carried out by Israeli aircraft flying over the Tehran area. And it's very important news because Ali Lariani was the secretary of the National Defense Council. Look at this chart here. Look at this organizational chart I'm showing you. You'll see that the National Defense Council is directly connected to the Supreme Leader. And he was the secretary of the council. In other words, he's kind of like the president of the council. So Ali Lariani's position was very high in the Iranian Defense Organizational chart. We don't have, at this moment as I'm recording here, an Iranian confirmation of Ali Lariani's death. So let's still treat this as an unconfirmed matter for now. If you're watching this later, feel free to correct me in the comments. But what does this really mean for Iran's ability to keep fighting in this war? Is this a decisive blow or actually just a setback? Is this something that can be fixed by Iran's defense structure? Well, from the beginning of the war, we've seen a very quick reorganization of the Iranian command at all levels. And this is due to a formal defense strategy of Iran called the Mosaic defense strategy, or decentralized Mosaic, right? There are many different translations out there. What we know, and I'll explain to you exactly what the Mosaic strategy is, it was created by Muhammad Ali Jafari, who was the commander of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard from 2007 to 2019. You saw there 12 years of command. That's a pretty long command. And Ali Jafari and the American wars that were happening simultaneously in Afghanistan and Iraq. And if you look at the map of Iran, you'll see that Afghanistan and Iraq are exactly on the two ends of the country. Iran borders Afghanistan and Iraq. So the Americans were there on the other side of the border for more than 20 years. So Jafari had more than enough time to closely analyze everything that happened there and there. He noticed a very clear pattern, a very clear operational pattern. And he saw not only how the Americans attacked, but also how the Afghans and the Iraqis defended themselves. And especially in the case of Iraq, which had large conventional armed forces, just like Iran does as well, Afghanistan didn't have that kind of military contingent there. In the beginning, there was always much less opposition, but Iraq had a very significant force. So Jafari noticed the similarities between Iran and Iraq. And since Iraq was quickly destroyed and decapitated, he did the math and managed to reach a kind of verdict. He understood that the Iraqi power structure was very pyramidal, very centralized here in the head of Saddam Hussein. And once Saddam Hussein was isolated from power, his inner circle was isolated, and the top commanders were removed from their positions. The entire structure collapsed very quickly. That's what happened in 2003, 2004 over there in Iraq. But the problem for Iran would be then to withstand this shock, to withstand this initial shock, and prevent an American victory, not win the war, but prevent an American victory. See how these two things are different. And Jafari, he didn't invent the Mosaic doctrine, or at least he didn't invent the precepts of the Mosaic doctrine. Why? Because it already exists and has already been tested sometimes, right? Many times, some of those times, successfully, right? who can really be considered the father of the doctrine of prolonged war, right? Who? Or decentralized, which is what the Mosaic is based on, right? What the Iranian Mosaic is based on. We can go back to Mao Zedong, back in the Chinese Civil War, from the 1920s until 1949. Mao Zedong, he realized there at the very beginning of the 1930s, at the end of the 1920s, that he wasn't in a position to fight Chiang Kai-shek anymore. Man, he wasn't able to fight the nationalists. He didn't have troops, he didn't have equipment, and he saw his enemy being heavily reinforced. So what did he do? He made a strategic retreat. This is the famous Long March. Mao Zedong left a rather privileged position, right, of guerrilla warfare there in southeastern China, and he withdrew his troops to northeastern China. In doing so, he lost a lot of people, about 1 million supporters. He lost during that march. And after that, he restructured everything. He restructured in a way to turn into a traditional guerrilla. He became a kind of continuous threat. Not exactly strong, but continuous, that would drain resources. In the end, he was helped by external events like World War II, right? He received a lot of material support from the Americans themselves during the war because he fought the Japanese during the war, not the Chinese nationalists. So he received material support from the United States, and that helped a lot with the outcome. Favorable to Mao Zedong during the Chinese Civil War, Ho Chi Minh, another revolutionary leader, used this same tactic of decentralization, of asymmetric warfare, of guerrilla warfare, to be able to win. The North American and South Vietnamese forces, much better armed, right? And with firepower far superior to that of North Vietnam itself, right? During the prolonged years of war in Vietnam, the Algerians did this, right, against the French, and the Afghans also did this against the Americans. So we see that the whole idea of decentralized warfare, the whole idea of prolonged and asymmetric war is not new, but it was incorporated by Ali Jafari into the Mosaic doctrine, Mosaic defense. The term itself was coined by him, by Iran, and it names the current Iranian national defense strategy, right? So the Iranians don't intend to win the war. They intend to deny victory. As I told you, by increasing the political and economic cost of the war for the enemy. How do you increase the political and economic cost? How do you increase the political cost? By transforming a situation that was clear, right? It was a clear situation of A versus B, of us against them, into a situation that involves a lot more people, that involves a lot more actors. And then the political cost is the diplomatic cost of these other countries' relations with the United States, and also the relationship of the American people with their government. Do you remember back in Vietnam when Jane Fonda went to North Vietnam and did a sort of tour with the North Vietnamese, receiving a Hollywood actress, man? And how much did that impact the United States, right, for the formation of anti-Vietnam War groups within the country? Today we have social media. We don't even need a Hollywood actress to go there. But in Iran, there's social media. So today, Iranian intelligence uses the internet to its advantage to also increase the political cost of the war, right, against the United States and Israel as well. Not that the other two don't do this as well, of course, because information dominance, information dominance is a domain that crosses all the other domains: land, sea, air, space, and cyberspace. Therefore, it's fundamental for political control, for the political costs of a war in the 21st century. And we also have the economic costs, right? The economic costs in the case of Iran are clearly related to oil and oil derivatives. Why? Because right there in the Persian Gulf on the Iranian coast are the largest oil deposits in the world, the largest refineries, and the distribution centers, right? And that particular geographic feature there in Iran on the Iranian coast, which is the Strait of Hormuz, is one. It's a gift for the Iranians because they can actually control the entire flow of oil in the whole region, right? By closing the strait, or like they're doing today, a selective closure of the strait, because it's not a 100% closure of the strait. They control which ships from which countries can pass and which ones can't, right? So some nations have safeguards, and some nations even manage to get safeguards by making some kind of deal with the Iranian government, benefiting Iran with some kind of exchange. This could be the supply of some kind of material, or in short, the facilitation of financing of some sort. You see then, right? The Strait of Hormuz is actually a major leverage point for the Iranian national defense doctrine. All right, so what does it consist of, man? Let's suppose now we're talking about the Mosaic doctrine, and up until now it hasn't been very used much in practice, except for the issue of replacing leaders, which I'm going to talk to you about here. Okay, why am I saying this, that it hasn't been used much? Because Iran hasn't been invaded, right? Iran, up until now, still hasn't been invaded. If it ever will be, it hasn't been invaded. So it's not yet like the situation in Vietnam, and it's not yet like the situation in Iraq and Afghanistan. There hasn't been a ground invasion of Iran up to now, but if there were a ground invasion of Iran, how would the Mosaic react? Well, Iran has two sets of armed forces, two independent groups. There is the Artesh, which is the traditional armed forces. That's the Army, Air Force, Navy, and a missile force. And there is the famous Iranian Revolutionary Guard, which also has ground, naval, air forces, and a missile force. However, the numbers in the Revolutionary Guard are much smaller than the numbers in the traditional armed forces, the Artesh. So guys, we can see that the traditional forces, which number about 350,000 men, most of them, of course, in the Army's ground forces. According to Mosaic, it is the traditional armed forces that should take the first impact of the war, that should take the first impact of the American invasion. In other words, the clash with the American ground forces should be handled by the Artesh. So it's assumed there would be a large number of casualties for the Artesh in the event of a ground invasion of Iran. The second wave, that is the second wave of resistance, not even attack, but resistance, is then assumed by the Revolutionary Guard. Since the Revolutionary Guard is much smaller compared to the Army, it has about 150,000 men. The Revolutionary Guard relies on another organization to fill its ranks of enlisted men, its actual combat personnel. What organization is that? A national militia called Basir. So it's this militia that has a municipal organization in Iran. Every small town, every village has a Basir office. To do recruitment and to provide basic military training for the new militiamen, these new militiamen are trained while they're still children. Boys there, at 12 or 13 years old, already start receiving basic military training. In other words, handling a rifle. How do you throw a grenade? They basically go through basic training to become at least minimally effective soldiers. But the numbers for Basir vary a lot. Some sources say 90,000, but others say there were up to 1 million men in Basir. And all of this will depend on the actual ability of the Iranian government to really bring these militiamen to the front lines, to actually bring them to the front. Because an estimate can actually push the numbers in any direction. But what about the real numbers? When the attack is actually happening, how many of these militiamen, who are actually ordinary citizens, right, will actually be taken to the front line, you know? So that's a huge question mark. In the Iranian defensive scheme, we can only really know in the case of a real invasion, right? So the Mosaic defense scheme assumes this order that I mentioned to you. While the missile force, which we're seeing in action now, the missile force, it provides the only system, the only layer of possible counterattack, right? Because this missile system, the whole missile program, is what will carry out long-range attacks. It's what will, for example, strike enemy bases, which it's doing now, which will hit the supply lines, which will hit the critical points for economic warfare, which is what it's doing now as well. Why? Because neither Aratesh nor the Revolutionary Guard have offensive capability at this moment, and they shouldn't have offensive capability. That's not expected. Their capability is defensive, and that's what's expected in the Iranian defensive model, right? And then comes the question of the successors, which I mentioned to you, right? Where we've already seen the Mosaic model working in a more obvious way. It's with the question of the successors. They say this is an idea from Ayatollah Ali Khamenei himself, who died on the first day of the war, right? To appoint 4 successors, is that why it's called the fourth successor model? You appoint 4 people to command all the important military bodies in the country. If one dies, you have a second. If the second dies or has any problem taking over, the third takes over. And finally, a fourth. Of course, if you kill the first one, you would have to appoint another so that there are always 4 appointed to command all the bodies, right? So, man, the Mosaic, it's called a Mosaic because Iran has 31 independent administrative regions. That's it. These Iranian commands, 31 commands, must act independently. They have instructions from Tehran, probably dating from the last days before the war. The latest ones, let's say, guide them within a set of parameters. But outside of that set of parameters, it's up to the regional commander to exercise his own autonomy in doing his job. He doesn't need to keep calling Tehran for new instructions. He already has his set of guidelines, right? Very well. The system is designed to be self-sufficient. Each of these 31 commands has to be self-sufficient. What does self-sufficiency mean? To have maneuvering capability, to be able to sustain itself in battle, that is, logistics, and to have command capability, to have command autonomy, to be able to act according to what it thinks is best in the situation it faces, right? And these 3 capabilities that I mentioned to you, they result in the capability for prolonged resistance, according to Ali Jafari's thesis. They result in the capability for prolonged resistance. In other words, if I have 31 commands that are independent and won't surrender just because Tehran surrendered, I can sustain prolonged combat for, I don't know, months or even years against an enemy force that invades my territory, right? As I already told you, there is a hierarchy in each of these 31 commands. First the Artesh, then the Revolutionary Guard, and the missiles covering all this action, right? But now I'm going to do a kind of critical analysis of this model. It can materialize in the event of an American invasion, right? Why is that, guys? Because the entire organic base, the foundation of a component of a military system, right? It's based on the command unit, Anyone who has studied management, scientific management, right? Anyone who has studied Henri Fayol, anyone who has studied Tell Me Here, in the comments, you'll remember a basic principle of Fayol's management, which is the unity of command. And the military are not exempt from this kind of need, right? From this kind of prerogative, from this vital point. The unity of command is essential for you to be able to respond properly, for you to react. So, when an enemy force sets out to invade your country and they choose a point to invade, let's look at the map of Iran. So look at the map of Iran if you choose, for example, the south of the country, near the Strait of Hormuz. To be able to carry out an amphibious landing, what are really your chances of defeating this amphibious landing, of pushing it back into the ocean, if there is no communication between the 31 military regions, the 31 commands? What is the possibility of this coastal command there in Hormuz receiving help, receiving reinforcements from other commands, if there is no coordination, if there is no central command? How would that really happen? Of course, emergency communication could coordinate things, but what if there is no communication and they are in fact isolated? Okay, later we can understand that once this invasion happens here, I can give examples from other places in Iran, sure. For example, I don't know if the Americans use Iraqi territory to invade through Khuzestan, which was where Saddam Hussein invaded in 1980, or even use what we saw last week, right? The Kurds through the north from the Iraqi border with Iran, which is already closer to Tehran. And once the Kurds are on the ground, you use logistical routes to reinforce the Kurds on the ground against the Iranian front. What is the possibility of the other commands aligning? The Central Strategic Reserve, there is a Central Strategic Reserve to be sent there. The second point of this Mosaic defense, which I would like to explain a little to you, is the very strong dependence on the militia, right? And throughout history, militias have a kind of combat quotient, right? A combat capability lower than that of the troops. Not only because their logistics are much worse, but also because the training of a militiaman is much weaker, much less than that of a soldier, particularly a soldier from the United States Army. So in a frontal battle, in a pitched battle, in an urban battle, against American forces, the militiamen who have no standardization will certainly, due to decades of sanctions, use different weaponry in different states of conservation, with ammunition depots, greatly reduced supply capabilities, I imagine. They would effectively have less combat capability than a well-supplied and uniformed force, like our should be, right? And so therefore we have a situation where reinforcements are either impossible or very difficult, because in a phase of ground invasion, the Americans have a doctrine for that, right? And they would have already completed the second stage of this doctrine, which is the interdiction of the battlefield. The Iranian battlefield would be interdicted. The rear of the Iranian forces would be interdicted. Therefore, supplies would be quite difficult to send, right? Therefore, I imagine that the Iranians today rely a lot on ammunition depots dug underground, there in tunnels, in depots, already pre-established, right? Pre-established and also finite. Therefore, finite. And then the Mosaic doctrine, ultimately, it favors the formation of guerrilla cells, of guerrilla hubs. Because if they are based on ammunition stockpiling points, right, in small ammunition depots, these ammunition depots consequently will not all be found and destroyed by the invading forces. At first, then, the invading forces at first will aim to overthrow the government. And therefore, these smaller ammunition depots, which are very likely to exist, will become rear problems. Rear problems with armed troops mean guerrilla strongholds in the rear. So even though the Mosaic shouldn't be a solution that will prevent the invading army from overthrowing the government in Tehran, it can indeed create a medium-term problem for the invading force with the formation of a large number of guerrillas and the very mountainous terrain of Iran. If you take a look, just check Google Maps, man, take a look at the terrain of Iran. The terrain of Iran is extremely mountainous. And this, of course, favors the operation of guerrilla groups. It favors the operation of guerrilla groups throughout the entire territory. And that's the big nightmare for the Pentagon today. You notice that I talked about the whole line. The whole line is not a problem for the Pentagon. It's a problem for the Pentagon. It's this last stage because the prolongation of a guerrilla war in a large and mountainous territory like Iran results in the famous endless war, which was the war in Afghanistan. They had to leave there because there was no solution. And they left there 4 years ago, so now they're about to start a new endless war. Since the guerrillas can very well cross the border into Afghanistan, rearm themselves, and return to Iran. That's the big question mark for the American decision-making process about invading Iran. That's what we're going to see unfold in the coming weeks. So now it's your turn to tell me. Did you already know about Iran's decentralized Mosaic doctrine? Is this new to you? Tell us in the comments because I want to know your opinion. If you like this video, don't forget to share it with your friends. Also, give us a thumbs up. Subscribe to War Room so you don't miss anything else. I'll stop here. Thanks again for watching, and here's a big hug from War Room.